Okay, so everybody, this is Cain Baum, local Chicago artist, sculptor. Did some teaching for us years ago when Nana was on sabbatical. So is familiar a little bit with the campus, and I was really excited to be able to invite him back to be our juror this year. So just please give him full attention. Some of this will be geared towards, I'm sure, nuts and bolts of an artist practice, but certainly relevant information for everybody, in addition to being able to see your work, see Cain's work. So just keep your phones and devices put away, just as a courtesy to Cain, and yeah, so let's give him a round of applause to welcome him.
Thank you.
Do you want me to make any changes to the setup?
No, I think this works.
Okay.
This works well.
Okay.
Yeah, the last time I was at North Park was actually the semester before the pandemic.
Yes,
so
that's right.
Kind of didn't get to see what life was like in the pandemic here, but seems like things are kind of like the same. It's nice. Yeah, thanks for letting me see your submissions today. I thought everything was really wonderful. The work was compelling and strong, and then the written statements were really additive and curious, and made for a really easy experience. So I kind of geared this talk towards showing some work that I have not shown before, especially images as they come out of my studio, and then Lee was like, speak on like your artistic trajectory, and so I kind of interrogated what that means to me. Am I on your? Let me see. Okay. So that's me in my studio. Yeah. So I tried to bring together some of the vocations that I have aside from my art practice that all, I believe, inform it. Tried to gather the many vocations that support and sustain my career as an artist. So firstly, I consider myself an artist and one that primarily sculpts. I'm also a woodworker and educator, and it is through deep observation and research that I create my sculpture. Using photographs, audio stories, furniture, cabinetry to sustain my living, aside from that art practice, and as tangential forms of creation. These duties and passions all sort of mix together as well. So they exist in my head, and I use my notes as artwork to store these ideas and the scenarios, scenes, structures, and forms, as you'll see. That's kind of what it is. So these arrows are forms that became sculptures, or notes that became sculptures. So yeah, I started noticing in my sketchbook I was doing a lot of like connecting of ideas to other ideas, and just using the arrow, which you might use in note-taking. For an exhibition, I brought them together with some sunflower stalks and some carved pieces of wood as the heads, and for like a very like simple idea I had in my head for a number of years, and then the actual sculptural creations received like a ton of feedback. So I can only recommend that you have these ideas bopping around in your head to figure out a way to get them down or out into form. This is kind of how they were in the gallery. They were situated in no specific direction, so myself and the curator were like, let's not have them point really anywhere specific, but as they exist in the notes, they're kind of going in different directions. Going to the wall.
Are those actual sunflower stalks?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and
Yeah.
then the arrow is made out of what material?
It's a wooden piece that's kind of carved.
Okay.
They were American African mammoths, I believe, so they got quite large, like that's over 9 feet tall. Let's see. So some act my making is to simply record the thoughts and relationships between these, and in relationships with people and animals, structures and places and time. So I capture through photograph the minutiae of day-to-day activity. I felt there were some artists that I saw over there that were also doing similar things of gathering what's around us and working with it. So I was really happy to see that. So I'm working to bring my camera with me as often as possible. It's kind of like a big film camera, but the more I take it with, the more information I kind of gather and the more archives I'll speak a little bit more about archives as well. And so when I do teach, I made these kind of diagrams to kind of help some of my students think about how we would approach the lessons. Thinking about storage for our ideas, so libraries, which is really great, but we're in a library. Library is a very important tool for me to use. Shoebox, banana peel holder, an iPhone, which later in this talk you'll see a very tragic moment with an iPhone. Let's see, and then just some diagrams of how I kind of approach making. Iteration, practice, and variation all kind of come into play. Okay. So for the purpose of this talk, I will mostly show images and talk about my sculpture with some adjacent work to support, because a sculpture is the foundation of my art practice. And I'll shine a light on specific practices that bring life to my work. We are note-taking, color creation, and tone setting using gradation, forms of organization, and how iteration builds through that organization. And finally, practice and how important that is. And so I think throughout these slides, which I'll click through kind of fast because there's a number of them, all of these practice elements are working simultaneously. My intention is that each photo can work to show these practices in action and somewhat isolated for better understanding of the parts of the whole. So as I go through, I'll use a handful of terms that work the same in my head. I call them practices, components, elements, actions, and behaviors. And they make up the trajectory of my art practice and the endeavors that sustain and inform them. So in this picture, these are these chicken wings that were purchased in the cafeteria at the grad school I went to, the Art Institute, and they were so salty, like I couldn't eat them. So I left them over the weekend in my studio, and I came back and they were like, nothing had changed. And so by 2023, nothing had changed with them either. And so, it makes me think about what am I consuming? In this case, salt and probably pretty processed food. And then, displaying them in a way that kind of resonates with some of the other forms that are going in my studio, which is this triangular shape that becomes part of a lot of different sculptures. So planning color schemes using different tones and things, just to kind of draw in the viewer through a different mood, and then using gradation as a form of movement to kind of activate scenes. So daily I'm tending to my sculpture and the ideas that move my artwork. Movement and static sculpture is a very important aspect of the work. I'm using abstraction, representation to achieve surrealism, building worlds where feedback loops and learning can flow from artwork to paper. I saw that kind of sentiment a lot, actually, in the statements, and I was happy to hear that because I think it's like a core function of artwork and people see artwork. but to put it into words like makes a very simple strategy quite complex. So just another way to kind of capture gradation with my camera is skies. The lake is very good. Natural elements that naturally kind of move color schemes. So this movement of ideas combines with the movement of color and forces upon a sculpture, all kind of working together. So I'm interested in presenting observations from routine living, as I've said before, to demonstrate the capacity of shapes, structure, and transition of color. Believing that these exist around the individual will do the work. I find that abstraction can work to energize and create a hybrid object, and that object can leave its realm of duty or existence or its character. I put this one in here because I painted the walls of my studio with a kind of gradation. It's really subtle, but it goes from light to dark, and so it becomes a really nice ground for photographs, and kind of keeps the peripheries around your pieces clean. So in this one, you kind of see my wall as well. And this is just an example of how my artwork is right up next to the furniture and cabinetry that I perform as well. So this wall separates, did up until last week, separates my art making space from my woodworking space, which I put it up because things were getting destroyed and damaged. And I think that there's a lot of rest that my work needs to just exist. So I make things kind of quickly and intuitively right away. So like right when I get the material or find it, and then I kind of need a rest period where I let it sit and I don't touch it and no one else touches it. And through that process, it starts to gain information and kind of evolve in my mind. In this case, these bathroom pieces stayed in my studio quite long while the project evolved as well. And I used the color sheet in this photo to kind of pivot the colors in this bathroom, which ended up all green, different shades of green. So I find that abstraction can work to energize and create that hybrid object I've said before. So this is an installation I did on the west side of Chicago at Ignition Projects, which is a really great space that in the title of the space, Ignition Projects, they really want you to focus on working on new kind of forms and new ideas that you have popping around your head. And so it was in this kind of window display, and I did the gradation here again, and then used some more structural based sculptures that had been in my notes for a long time and that I hadn't had the opportunity to make before. And then really using that color and that gradation of color to affect the kind of mood, which was supposed to be kind of antagonizing in a way, so lots of reds and oranges, and kind of make you stop to consider. Because one of the focuses that I was thinking about were advertisement architecture, and so these neighborhoods where my studio is and where this gallery is, they have these like looming billboards that have nothing to do with life in the neighborhood. They're just these ideas from someone else with a little bit more money, plaguing kind of the neighborhood. So that's kind of the height element that we're seeing. So moving on, I'm working hard to stay organized. I think it's very important, especially when you do something like I did today, to have your files all in good spaces so that you can just go to them, and they're ordered by year or material. And so I think about some of these furniture items that I made, they're shelving, and these different spaces made for a particular purpose. In this case, this is a record shelf that holds the stereo and the record player and the records on the side. So everything kind of has a very purpose-built duty in space. Another library kind of scene that I appreciated. So with the photography that I'm working with as well. Once you print those photos and things, for me it becomes kind of like a very tactile and physical object, and so another thing I'll get to at the end of this is kind of some tools of the trade that I kind of rely on, and one of them is just a printer that I have at home, and so I'll resend photos through the printer and kind of offset the colors and try and kind of use the colors to shape the plane and just mix up an average kind of photograph into something a little bit more wild. Another form of organization that I work with is kind of this like grid shape, and so when I make these kind of smaller forms, one-off in the studio, kind of quickly, rather than having them like sit around the studio, which they will collect dust because my studio is really dusty. They kind of find shape and form on these grids, and then I can kind of add to them, and then they kind of work to become their own two-dimensional, three-dimensional forms. So this is some cabinetry that I did about 6 months ago. So thinking about these systems of organization, if they came before the cabinetry, or if they're informed by the cabinetry and the furniture, because clients come to me and they're like, we need some peace in our home, and we have too much going on, and so each thing then has a home to live, like your fridge, and then your alcohol goes in there, pillows go in there, and you sit right there. Or in this case, the spice racks, everything is visible. You can also see that there's a different treatment of the material in the cabinetry. I get to be less intuitive and less maybe fun when I do the cabinetry, because it's for someone else going in someone else's home. They're paying me, and so I have to make sure miters are tight, wood grain is the same. So there's some relief that comes with doing my artwork, especially in that studio. So I put together a little video, something I made last week, and something that I've been working on or thinking about for quite a long time.
So it's a time lapse?
But this may be hard to understand, but that wall, I had mentioned before that I had a wall in my studio that ceased to exist still. So I've since moved that wall to a wheeled kind of situation, so that I can open up my art space to my woodworking space and have those forms start to play together. Because there's like an extreme compartmentalization happening within me, separating the woodworking for others from the artwork for me. But as I took more and more studio visits, people that came through were like really attracted to like the woodworking, and I guess they understood it as giving maybe some integrity to the artwork that they otherwise didn't know. So I've kind of leaned into that and started to just bring it all together. And I think in my head, there's no way to separate the way that they inform each other. And at the end of this slideshow, there's some more of that cabinetry. So yeah, this is the tragic iPhone story. I don't think I need to say this, but I would recommend that you back your stuff up in many ways, either through the cloud or through a hard drive. And so, as a result, all of these photos that I'm showing you are all from the last 3 or 4 years. So, those 10,000 images were all pre-pandemic stuff. So, yeah, and I think it had like a profound effect on the way that I think about storage of my work, but also keeping the work of others. And so, I have a flat file at home, and so I have a couple of drawers that are dedicated to all the exhibitions that I go see of my friends and things like this, and so I try and collect memorabilia and just collect glimpses and moments from the things that I'm doing now. And you know, before I had all those photos that I lost, I would take these photos, like say of like my pets or something like this. Like, why am I taking 15 to 20 photos of a cat or a dog? Like, what are you going to do with them? But when that cat or dog is gone, go back through those photos. You're like, wow, I'm really glad that I took the time to make this silly photo of this animal. So yeah, it comes with not deleting your work or not throwing work away. Just finding a way to hold on to it. It can be burdensome, but I think that it's ultimately rewarding to be able to see your work and go back to it. And that's like a key function of the iteration we'll talk about in a moment. Yeah, so I think that organization then helps to store some of this work, and then kind of start to see the pieces in your sculpture, in your artwork that like repeat, and then you can start using these motifs, and then you can almost just take them one by one, or at least I do, take them one by one and kind of mix them around and create new sets of works. So those grid pieces that I was working with, they're interchangeable, and so things kind of can be made on the fly or adapted to a situation. Like this piece, which, while these triangles all have like a hole to exist in, I think they can exist outside of there and have as much to say away from its like main body. And so with iteration, I think also comes a lot of photography as well. So trying to take the same pictures in the same places, either at the same time or different times. And so in my studio, I'm kind of often setting up my camera in the same spot and just trying to capture things as they change. And so that like time lapse that someone mentioned over here is, it's kind of like that. Like, what do we see in the minutia of those little moments passing? There I am looking at something, but the things on the bench change, and the camera stays the same. So this is some bed that I was working on, and the triangular piece is yet to be created, and a studio neighbor had given me a tree. And so just some other like informative shapes and things happening in the studios that kind of inform some of these iterative moments. I think a lot of those triangles that I'm working with, the triangles and the line works, come out of these Keelan rug patterns. And then we're going to kind of get into like little animals here in a second. Another kind of iterative photo I like to take is, I live close to the lakefront, so just trying to get to the lake as much as possible to capture the scenes, right? To capture that gradation of water to sky, but also I think taking walks is a hugely important part of my practice. You know, it's kind of like doesn't have an ending to it. So you go out on a walk, and there's no intention of going somewhere. You, I guess, intend to come back. But like, what are you looking for? And like, for me, it could be foraging for material, but it's become less and less about actually finding like detritus along the lakefront, and more about continually gathering these photographs and taking that time to kind of reflect and just be out in the scenery. So again, just kind of marking where I frequent. This is my studio building. You can see somewhere in there. And you know, bringing the camera to the studio and having I don't know if anyone's familiar with a film camera, but it pulls the shutter with a little pop of air, so it's kind of like the original self-timer. And so another thing that I notice on my walks or through iteration or things that help me kind of understand my perspective a little bit is the perspective of like smaller animals, especially birds and fish. I think they occupy different areas of our existence in the sky or in the water, but they're very close by. And to think where they exist is it's different than we are, but it's related. And I have this, my home is right here, so there's this crack between my home and the next house. And that crack, I kind of investigated a lot. It's like an art space. So it's 8 inches wide. So there's no human that I know that can go in this crack. The only thing that exists in there are different teams of raccoons. So you can see there's 1, 2, and 3 in there. And they have created little hammocks, and they hang between them. And they have carved a hole in the side of the house that they can get up into the attic with. And so I actually catch them. I'm at 14 right now. I have a heart cage, so I catch them in the cage, and I take them to 111 and 94, and I let them out on the Indiana side. And it's become a ritual, kind of like I don't know, spending time with a different creature in the back of my car, and I make sure they're fed so that there's always food in the cage so that they don't get like upset and come after me. But I'm still like working out ways to fix this hole inside of the house. It's like a forever project. But they're very cute, and yeah, they're never mean, ever mean. So yeah, I think Chicago's a very unique place, very diverse with its bird population as well. So like I said before, just trying to find different perspectives and different birds. And so I have a whole archive of all the different birds that are flying. And then when you print them and then sculpt around them, I think they can be really wonderful activators of a flat plane. So again, just taking pictures of the homes around me and working with them a little bit. Let's see. And so we come to practice, which is I am kind of practicing every day with the work that I do aside from my artwork. So think about wood being like my primary material. I'm using that wood to make cabinets and to make furniture to sustain my life, but it also then works to build my artwork. And so each day I'm like learning a little bit more about the material and being in my studio a lot and photographing birds. I think about where I'm going to store these birds or how I might use them, or maybe I don't. But so like iteration then becomes this form of practice where I build something and I let it rest and then I get back to building it and it changes ever so slightly and it becomes something, so it starts to hold, it starts to build up. You remove the blue tape and it starts to look more like a finished object. Larger chunks of wood get like carved down to these kind of usable forms. Sometimes they go back, they kind of become these shapes that you can kind of wrestle with and move and change as you do. And then we kind of see the things in the studio becoming tools to be used in the studio. So this board kind of had some natural capabilities, and so I use it, I just stand on it kind of like a skateboard that doesn't like go anywhere, but you can turn it. And I found that it's a really good place to process ideas, and process, I don't know, to just exist in the studio is an important factor, I think, in making the work. To not have to like be producing something, but to just be in there, organizing what you have, or playing with the things that need to be maintained. So these are some of the cabinetry things that I'm doing as well. So they get built in the studio and they get staged in there, so I can address all of the things that might happen on site. And so I build the carcasses. I find where all the doors are gonna go, and then take it all apart, put it on this cart, color it, bring it up to site, install it. Yeah, and so a lot of times I'm spending like quite a lot of time with this stuff in the studio. And very rarely do I ever get to enjoy it when it's in this state. This one happens to be my sister's home, so I get to see how the things that I make withstand like the day-to-day like burden of like a family using them. And it's rewarding to see that the things that you make can stand that test. And it's all really the furniture and the cabinetry is to make the most precision things happen, so that all these little gaps are an eighth of an inch, and so that precision being something to seek, but it's nice to shed when I'm in the art studio. And just a final thought on iteration. These are these mangoes that I've made and played with in many different orientations, but in this one they like serve to hold something down. They use their weight, and then in this one they can become their own thing and kind of stand and wobble, and just the way that they're kind of composed together, they kind of have this like walking kind of feature. And a friend of mine put it in a show at like a Mies van der Rohe house at the Elmhurst Art Center. And yeah, it was just surrounded by a number of other.
What is it covered with?
This?
Yes.
That is plaster with resin, and then
And what's under it?
this part.
Yes.
That's on a like on a coffee table. But everything in this room was made by a different designer.
I mean, like the one that was covered in plaster. What's?
Oh, like what's underneath
What's underneath
that
the
layer?
Oh, this?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the raw plaster. So, yeah, precision's really kind of metered in this piece compared to the furniture piece, right? Because I guess precision would have me covering the whole thing and not like showing the material underneath, but it's kind of like the beauty of like artwork is that you don't need to be like that. And I think like the more like robust and like material that you have is like, just as desirable as that precision. But that's all I have. So thank you.
Questions? I have like 9 questions, so I,
Yeah,
Hey, good to see you.
good to see you too. It's fun to see all of this work. I was just thinking about like how animated so many of these forms become. They have this like lively playfulness to them that makes me think of a variety of artists, but like one person I keep thinking of in relation to this is Nancy Graves, and the way that she like takes these sort of common forms and then casts them and like reforms them into these kind of wild.
Beautiful.
Have you seen her work before?
I've never seen her.
Oh,
No,
I was so
super
curious
excited.
if you were, I don't know, if she lived in your head at all.
No, but I had a moment over here today where I kind of went back and I realized I hadn't
Yeah.
put any kind of artist for other people to look at. And I was thinking today, I was like, what artist am I looking at? And I haven't, I don't know if I've like updated that list in my head in a long time. So that's
Right.
really wonderful to hear about this person, because that's like a very similar thing when I think about this, how to kind of reanimate these things.
Right, and especially because you're working with forms in your carpentry practice that are like so utilitarian and straightforward and like clean and beautiful, that like to have this sort of wild other life of these materials and forms really interesting, and
Yeah.
that's what feels like a kind of similarity, something you might check with her work.
Absolutely, I'll definitely check her out. I had a professor that I'm still in touch with come through the studio, and he's like, often are you selling your work? And he's like, if you're doing these projects for other people, you should be forcing them to like take a piece of your work to like further like,
Include it.
yeah,
Yeah.
and to like you say like animate that work in a way, because I think that like the mango pieces would be really wonderful next to that like pink kind of credenza.
Yeah.
So that's I'm like working to like get my artwork to these people as well.
That's nice.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, if they're signing on to
Yeah,
get
exactly.
your work, why not, you know?
Yeah, 100%. And, so much so that I think one of like another container for all this information that might be like a no-brainer, but like a CV as well, to keep these kind of individuals that I build things for in like personal collections and things like this, and adding that to the CV as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I have like a few just really quick like technical questions.
Please.
One is like, so you mostly use like an analog camera, like a print camera, and then do you print the photos yourself, or do you have them printed?
The only benefit I have being an alumni of the Art Institute
Yeah.
is they have a very nice print center that
Yes.
has like an online interface, and I never used it when I was a student, and I've only used it as an alumni.
Okay.
And so I like to print on papers that have like a real like textural
Textural,
element
yeah.
to it.
And do you do the doubling or the offset digitally, or do you do it analog, like by feeding it through the printer twice? Or?
Yeah, so those ones I'm doing at home. I will play with the colors in Photoshop and then print and then just resend it through.
Okay.
And yeah.
And then, where is your studio?
It is a really wonderful space. If anyone ever goes down there, it's in McKinley Park
Okay.
on Damon and Pershing. They're massive buildings. It's called the Chicago Industrial Quarter, I think. And so these buildings are like a block long.
Yeah.
And so there's artists in there, there's builders in there, there's people who like live there. And it's like a completely bizarre and inspiring place. I kind of feel like it's, of all the studio spaces in Chicago, I call it kind of like the Wild West of them. There's no like telling what you'll run into, but when you get a space in there, you kind of just get the plot, and then you have to build the walls, and then run all the things to it, like electrical and stuff. But
Do you share it with anybody?
I share it with my dad.
Okay.
So right around when I went to grad school, I left my studio, and my parents left their house where they had a garage, and so he kind of turned half the studio into like a garage space for him. But now he's retired, and so he also like woodworks and tinkers and builds machines and things like this. And he's a retired doctor, so he's kind of bringing that information to building, which I think is really curious. Yeah.
So again, another sort of like precision wildlife combo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you know what? I forget I didn't put this picture in, but this studio they have a clock tower, Art Nouveau clock tower, that no one has spaces in anymore because it's like real decrepit. The only things that live in there are falcons.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I had one fly through the studio window top speed and land on my studio shelf. And, like,
Wow.
this thing was so like prehistoric looking, like it lived many, many lives before I had even seen this thing. It knew its way around the interior of that building, and so it had gone in. And I think it just goes in and hunts.
Whoa.
Yeah, hunts the rats and other whatever else is
What
there.
other else? Yeah. Oh my gosh.
It's a great space if you're ever down there.
Okay. Do you live close to the studio, or like what? How do you manage the time?
That's a good question. It was really important for me when I got this new studio space to have it close to my home. So I live just east of there, roughly in Brownsville. The
Okay.
neighborhood is technically Oakland.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just directly east. And so right around actually in the pandemic, I was working for a cabinet shop on the west side of Chicago, and I was realizing I was spending like over 2.5 hours in the car on the
Yeah.
commute, and I was like, this is killing me because I want to go to the studio after work, or I want to go home and like clean my house.
Right.
And yeah, just pandemic for all of its negative side effects, I guess it had a nice positive that I got to like reorient my life
Yeah.
to my energy being expended on the south side,
Mhm.
near my home and near my studio.
Right, yeah. That was, that, when I heard like industrial complex, I was just like, that seems like it could be potentially like either, you know, like how would you manage if it was a longer commute time?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
that's a real hard thing to like have any distance really geographically between you and your workspace.
Yeah, and so I've also, because of the cabinetry and furniture, I work out of my studio every day.
Yeah.
So I've like spent a long time kind of engineering this like lifestyle for myself.
Yeah.
And it feels very rewarding right now to be able to go into the studio or the shop, as I call it some days, to kind of separate my headspace. And yeah, I feel very fortunate about that. But now it's a process of making sure I don't spend too much time working on the projects for others, and then I get to the other side of that wall and I can spend my time.
That was what I was gonna ask, is like, how do you balance that, you know,
Um,
the client needs and then like your own personal work?
Yeah, a work in progress for sure. And I'm getting better at it as I kind of start to understand the times that I work best at, and start managing my time a little bit more appropriately.
Well, and budget too, like you kind of have to say, like, this is the amount of work I need to take on to
Yeah.
keep all the lights on.
Exactly. That's important. And then, yeah, another kind of thing that holds information that I didn't use before is like a calendar. Just having like a building schedule, and yeah, and spending X amount of time doing like finding work, and X amount of time processing material, and yeah, making
Yeah.
sure that I have time to also run the administrative side of my art practice, which I had in my notes but I never said it, but these kind of events where you get to talk about your work is like super valuable, you know, and it makes you put together ideas that you might not have had before. In this case, a lot of these images I haven't shown before, so it was a good opportunity to show new work. Yeah, a reason for upsetting the original idea of like what exhibition is. And so the same thing goes for when you're applying to things, like this submission process. Like it just asks that you critically look at your application materials and then reform them to the specific thing. And so I would say that in the past couple of years, I really put a little bit more effort into applying to things, and yeah, it gets you writing, or it gets you constantly reorganizing your portfolio and paying attention to that.
It seems like there's a pretty tight relationship between like all of the sort of the categories that you mentioned, which is like lines up with sort of like how you said that you compartmentalize your own life. If you just hit shift a bunch of times, it should. But but the idea that so many of those sculptures, especially the sunflower, like feel like it's a drawn line in through the space, and it doesn't feel that dissimilar from like how it would look on the page of your sketchbook, especially like the vertical orientation of the photograph in your sketchbook, and like the way that it kind of delineates the space in the gallery, and then the photograph almost becomes like a drawing, like it becomes like another surface, especially if it's printed, I guess, but even just here. And I wonder, like, if that kind of like factors into your creative thinking, like when you're in the studio and you're making one sculptural piece. Like there were photographs of your studio where it seemed like everything kind of was almost a stage for these characters, and then like the whole stage becomes the work, like,
Yeah.
and less about each individual piece. Like it's all the scene, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I wonder, like, when you submit work, or even like that logistical end, but even when you like make something for a show, or somebody picks one piece, like, is there a mode that you work that feels more natural or more challenging? Like, I can see that it might be, there might be contexts where it's more challenging to just make one piece for a group show rather than have full reign over a solo exhibition, like,
Yeah.
you know?
Oh, for sure. I think one of the challenges in the submission process is how to photograph and capture these works, because I think they like use the other things to play off of. And then, yeah, I think separating these things is just becomes, in my head they are a little separate, but you know, sometimes I think like that, you know, I'm always making new things, and like maybe I should focus on like some sort of body, but then when I see it in the studio, like things are working together. And that was another thing that I tried to change in the studio is when I got back into it after school, my dad had garagified it. It was like, it was crazy. Like I couldn't focus. I had like a really hard time seeing where artwork was in there, because you know, there were like shelves and there were like actual like nuts and bolts and coffee cans, and like he's older, so he wanted everything a little bit closer to him, so he didn't have to walk across the shop. But once I created that space for myself, I painted the floor white, I painted the walls, and you know, like I said, I'm fortunate to have that space, but I really like didn't want to have any tools or like large amounts of raw material in there, and so I try and keep that out and keep the studio space more of like a staging kind of cube. But it's hard to do that too, so when I'm in my studio mindset or in that space, I try to use more hand tools as well. So like sharp chisels and like a little razor saw, you know, and then that kind of adds to the personalization of each little piece. Yeah, I hope that answered kind of what you're saying.
I think, yeah, I'll take anything.
Cool. Yeah, it's it has been a challenge lately to submit photos and things, because my documentation is still, it's just work in progress. All of it is, but that is, I find to be very challenging.
There's something really interesting about seeing the work too in the many ways that you showed it to us here. Like there were a few pieces where you showed us just like a singular piece in front of a wall in a way that's like much more traditionally shot, you know, photographed as sculpture, and then so many where the sculptures become components of a larger sort of installed space, and they're all like bouncing around and talking to each other and like having, you know, putting on a play or something. Like it feels like they're really doing a lot of communicating. And so I'm wondering how, like by photographing it and seeing the work in all these different ways, if you feel like they kind of take on a life that you don't necessarily expect when you start them, or if you sort of imagine them as components of a bigger space that can be like taken away or added to, or just, I'm just curious to hear you talk about that, because it definitely feels like you're not necessarily thinking about them only as like discrete, singular forms, but that there's always like a context that they're integrating within.
Absolutely. I think that they are definitely made to play together. And then, yeah, I think that they're, like, the more time that's invested in that thing, or whether or not I know, like, the fragility of the actual piece, yeah, you spend a good amount of time maintaining the things as well. And in that, they break, unfortunately, and then they just get either like reiterated or yeah, get kind of done up again. I have no problem. I used to have things against like painting the wood or like harming it in some way, but I've kind of thrown that away. I'll paint it. I'll glue it. And yeah, I think that the iteration then becomes this like component I'm playing with just as much, and like iteration and then modularity of the sculpture, because I've like gotten to this point with most of the sculptures that I've made since living in Chicago, but there's only like, and I guess I'm working to figure out why there's this like specific pieces that still look like they once did, and then why others don't make it to that point. But yeah, when you're working with like a bigger sculpture, it's like that space is like really like fought after, and so they get melded into new pieces, or they start to serve different functions. Yeah, and so with that little stop motion video I showed, it's just like an homage, I guess, to maintaining and taking care of the I would say a lot of those things on that shelf were still their original holes to when they were created. So just, you know, being able to see the things so I could take it off the shelf and bring it into that scene. And so then that's like a necessary activity in the studio that I'll do sometimes, like maybe after a day in the shop building, I'm quite exhausted, and the thought of working on the tools to make something new is kind of draining to think about. So I'll pull up a chair in the studio and pull things down, kind of play with them. And that's maybe something I didn't say, but I think that there is a lot of play and fun that happens in the studio when I start to do that. And I think then that animates the piece in a way. As well as like I'll put legs on something. I think legs are a nice form that I kind of go back to, and trying to figure out how to make, and maybe it's a sculptural thing too, but trying to make something stand up with as least points to the ground as possible. So 3 will always stand up pretty well, 4 is like really solid, and 2 and 1 you're kind of on like a precarious line, and then your piece will fall over in the gallery or something like this, which isn't good. But yeah, that's good questions. I like answering those. I think that my sculpture's mostly installed. I think that where I studied in Iowa, everyone at that time was doing like large installations, and that's kind of what I was around when I was learning, and I think I've always just kind of appreciated that kind of immersive experience, where there's like lots of little things to kind of think about as a viewer, audience person.
Anything else from anybody? Thank you so much.
Cool, thank you.
So, just a couple of nuts and bolts stuff for the students. So I